Hi, welcome to this session, which is a guide to the UPSC English Literature optional exam. So, in this series, we are not just breaking down the syllabus, we are also exploring how to study English literature so that you can become an expert in answering UPSC questions with depth and clarity. See, our goal is not just the exam, but also for mastering certain prescribed texts and become an expert. Like, I see, uh, if you look at the syllabus, which will shortly present, if you look at the syllabus, um, it is not as detailed as some of the other courses like MA in English Literature from IGNOU. I have looked at both the papers, the UPSC main exam papers for English Literature and also the English Literature papers from MA IGNOU. I found that MA IGNOU papers are much tougher and they cover a large range, they cover a large number of things, while the UPSC exam is selective and focused. So it would be I would say it's rather easy to prepare for the UPSC paper if you are already aware of a lot of topics in English literature. Okay, so let's begin by looking at the syllabus. Okay, so we have two papers, paper 1 and paper 2. And let's look at the syllabus. We have William Shakespeare's King Lear and the Tempest. Shakespeare wrote a lot of comedies, tragedies, and history. But here you are very selective in the exam. Like you just have these two words given as the syllabus, like King Lear and the Tempest. That narrows it down and makes it easier to study. Okay, there is John Donne, and his selected poems are given, like Canonization, Death, Be Not Proud, The Good Morrow. These are some famous poems of John Donne. And we have Milton, like Paradise Lost. But I see that only books 1, 2, 4, and 9 are there. So it's limited. John Milton's Paradise Lost is a huge epic. I mean, it has like several lines of poetry. It's a huge ocean kind of thing. So it's quite narrowed down, right, in the syllabus. So, and you have Alexander Pope next, one of his famous poem, Rape of the Lock. And you have some select poems of William Wordsworth. So we'll go through all this, and we have Alfred Tennyson, In Memoriam. In Memoriam, I would say, is one of the greatest one of the greatest poems in English language. Uh, the language is amazing, and Tennyson represents emotion very well. He represents grief very well, and I feel it's one of the best poems in English literature. Then we have A Doll's House by Henrik. We have Jonathan Swift's Gulliver Travels, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, Henry Fielding's Tom Jones. See, these are some very common works. It is good that the syllabus is focused and narrowed down because if you would study English literature for things like MA, you would find the course as huge ocean. I mean, there are so many authors. You know, English literature is a very, very vast subject. I mean, you can study English literature your whole life and still not be able to cover everything, right? It's kind of ocean. Okay, so yeah, now let's get back to the syllabus. Henry Fielding's Tom Jones. Tom Jones is a very long novel, really long and detailed novel. So uh, it's better that you have read a lot of things before you even think about appearing for these kind of exams that are related to literature. The reason I'm saying this is See, you might be getting used to time-bound preparation. Like you have an exam coming up in 1 year and you're preparing for that. But for subjects like English literature, it's a lifelong thing. So unless you're really into English literature, I wouldn't recommend picking English literature because see, I found a lot of students of particularly in MA English. See, as soon as they get into MA, they are like surprised. So they think they are very good in English and they think that that makes them good in English literature. So let me make a clear distinction. Being good in English is another thing. Getting into literature is something very, very, very different. I mean, you might need to be really, really very well read if you are thinking about mastering English literature. It is not something that is doable in 6 months or a year. So better have that in mind if you're already the kind of guy who likes reading, who is a writer, who himself has mastered the language through several years of study. This might be something for you. Okay, this is not something that I'm saying to discourage, but people really need to know what they are getting into. See, especially I found people, they just want their goal in life to just have a job. Okay, so they get into English literature and they do some, try to do some course like MA, but then when they see what they are getting into, they really might not be able to sustain the torture because it's torture unless it's torture reading like 10,000 lines of Milton unless you are really interested in him. That's what I meant. Right? Okay, let's get back now. And we have Charles Dickens' Hard Times. Charles Dickens wrote a huge number of works. Each of his his unabridged novels are like 1,000 pages long. So it will take some reading effort. But here it's just one novel, so it's quite good. It's doable, right? Okay, then you have George Eliot's The Mill on the Floss. That is one of his famous books. Thomas Hardy. You have Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. Okay, the other paper, there are two papers. That was the part one syllabus. This is paper two syllabus, right? Paper one syllabus was what we described here. Paper two syllabus is here. So these are like, okay, W.B. Yeats. He is quite unavoidable. I mean, his famous poems include Sailing to Byzantium, Leda and the Swan. And we have T.S. Eliot. So T.S. Eliot wrote several famous works, including The Wasteland. The Wasteland doesn't seem to be included here, but it's good to be aware of Eliot's works. Um, Eliot's work, The Wasteland, is not really very easy to read. You might really need to get it, but it's not here, so it's fine. Okay, now our goal is not just to look at clearing an exam, right? It is not about that at all. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about how to study English literature generally. And then when you are comfortable with the subject, clearing the UPSC exam is fine. I mean, the optional paper is easy to clear. Okay, so okay, you have W.H. Auden, you have John Osborne, Samuel Beckett. All these are waiting for that. These are like famous works. Philip Larkin's, Ramanujan's work, Joseph Conrad's Lord Jim. So the heart of darkness of Joseph Conrad is not there really. Uh, James Joyce, the portrait of an artist is a young man. Uh, James Joyce's other famous work was Ulysses. Okay, then we have D.H. Lawrence, E.M. Foster, Passage to India, his most famous work. Virginia Woolf's Dalloway. Okay, we have Naipaul and Raja Rao. Okay, now I would also recommend going through books like the Norton Anthology for English Literature too, because that gives you a lot of context and background. Okay, so remember in this UPSC exam, it's quite narrowed down. I mean, you are not required to probably know out Chaucer's work or Middle English or works that are regarded as Anglo-Saxon English. Right? You don't need to know about Beowulf. Not for the exam. I mean, if you are a literature student, you should probably go and look at that as well. So let's. Um, okay. Now another thing is I will start with some of the more difficult works. Okay. I mean, I would start with John Milton. Okay. So among all these works, I find John Milton may be the toughest. For some reason, people often avoid talking about Milton's work. Probably they find it difficult to read. The way in which Milton writes is probably not that easy to comprehend for most of the people. So I would like to start with John Milton first. Okay, so let's begin. Okay, so let's get into it. We are going to directly start with Milton. Okay, so Milton is not for the faint of heart. His poetry demands attention, erudition, and patience. But then there are rewards, like it has sublime imagery and metaphysical depth. So, um, he wrote it in blank verse, that is unrhymed verse, and there are like 12 books in the epic. It's huge. I mean, it would take like years to probably fully understand the book. People might be put off by his writing style. I mean, that would be a challenge. But then, my goal is not to give summary of his works. I would like to go line by line and discuss in detail because that's what makes you a master. You do not want a superficial summary and then just think, and then you would think that okay, this is enough for the exam. That is not how we are going to study for this. I would request you to read the poem. I mean, most people just read reviews and criticism of the poem and some abridged version of the original work. I would recommend you to not do that. I would recommend you to go and read the poem line by line. And that's what I'm going to do here. And let's begin. It might be a little bit difficult to understand in the beginning, but then I would here, I'm also going to talk about the paraphrase, that is converting it to a simpler text. Okay, let's begin. Of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world and all our woe, with laws of Eden, till one greater man restores us and regain that blissful seat. Sing heavenly muse that on the secret top of Oreb or of Sinai didst inspire the shepherd who first taught the chosen seed in the beginning how the heaven and earth rose out of chaos. Or if Sion hill delight thee more, and Siloam's brook that flowed fast by the oracle of God, I thence invoke thy aid to my adventurous song that with no middle flight intends to soar above the Aeonian mount, while it pursues things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. Okay, so you might need to be familiar with the topic. I mean, the topic of man's disobedience and the fruit that was forbidden, fruit of the forbidden tree. Um, this theme from the Genesis is what he's talking about here. Okay, so let me make the sentences a little bit easier to understand. See here, he is in Milton is following tradition. Like in his time, most of the people stuck with tradition. I mean, novelty and originality were not really encouraged because it was believed that the masters of epics and Homer, Virgil, they had already said what was to be said. And then your unique mastery would be indicated by how well you can be following the tradition. So that what Milton does. The break from the tradition comes in much later, followed by Wordsworth and Shelley and Keats, right? But it's interesting, like even John Keats tried to imitate Milton in form. I mean, you might read his works like Hyperion, The Fall of Hyperion. He's not trying to copy Milton, but he's trying to be just like him. Why? Because he's influenced by Milton. I mean, Milton has such an amazing influence on the later writers. He is like a giant. I mean, Milton is the ultimate standard, probably, against which people measured themselves, against which the subsequent writers measured themselves. Okay, so here let's understand that he is following a tradition and he is invoking the muses before writing the poem. Okay, so it is interesting that most of the epics begin with the invocation of the muses. What are the muses? You should be familiar with the 9 muses. Read about them if you're not already familiar. The Greek goddesses of poetry, of history, of music. They were the music. They were the muses, right? Okay, but now, see, let me reconstruct the sentence in a paraphrase so that it becomes easier to read. So, what is talking about? I mean, what is Milton talking about? He is directly saying, sing heavenly muse of man's first disobedience and the forbidden fruit that brought death and suffering into the world and caused the loss of Eden, until one greater man should come to restore it. Okay, here it is interesting. He is not directly, he's not just invoking the muses, he's asking the muse himself to sing. So that's how you should read it. So the sentence is like this: sing heavenly muse, sing of what? Of man's first disobedience. And so that's how you should read it, right? And then there is a clause on the heavenly muse, right? Which heavenly muse? The same one that on the secret top of Horeb or Sinai did inspire that shepherd who taught the chosen seed. Now, now what heavenly muse is he talking about? The one who inspired Moses, right? On Sinai, right? So, he is not talking about, so here is the departure. He is trying to, his form and structure, he is invoking the muses. But he wants to depart and not talk about the pagan muses, right? He is talking about the heavenly muse now. So it's interesting. So, and which heavenly muse is talking about the Holy Spirit that inspired Moses. Where is it written, Moses? It is the shepherd, because he's talking about that shepherd who first taught the chosen seed in the beginning how the heaven and earth rose out of chaos. Right? So he is talking about Moses. Okay. And there is no direct mention of Moses, but it's very clear that the shepherd who taught the chosen seed was Moses. And he's talking about how the heaven and earth rose out. So he is referring to Genesis, okay? Genesis of creation. Again, see, I would like to break it down like this. Okay, the entire paragraph. Sing heavenly muse of man's first disobedience and the forbidden fruit that brought death and suffering into the world, that caused loss of Eden, until one greater man should come to restore it. What greater man are we talking about? We are talking about Christ. Okay. Inspire me. Who should inspire him? He's still talking about the heavenly muse. Inspire him as he once inspired Moses on Mount Horeb or Sinai. Okay. So that's what it is. But here is one more sentence. Or if it, okay, here he also says, or if Sion Hill delight thee more, and Siloa's brook that flowed past by the oracle of God, I thence invoke thy aid to my adventurous song. So it's a way of saying, okay, heavenly muse, if you prefer to be addressed as the one who was by Siloa's brook, then from there I would like to invoke my adventurous song. Okay, so how do I know it is from there? The word thence. Thence mean from where, from what place, from that place. Okay, so he's saying from what place he, see, I have paraphrased the entire thing here. Or if it pleases you more, muse of Zion Hill and Sion's brook, flowing besides the temple of God, let your voice come from there to aid me in this daring poem. Thence is what represents from there, right? Okay. Also, this is okay. Also, here is a bold claim by Milton. Look at this. I thence invoke thy aid to my adventurous song, that with no middle flight intends to soar above the Aeonian mount, while it pursues things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. So, here is a claim that Milton makes. He says, this is no ordinary poem that I am writing. I am writing something that goes beyond the Aeonian mount. Aeonian mount is the mount, famous mount, right? That is mentioned in classical Greek literature. So, he's not talking about the normal pagan kind of poetry. He is saying that he's talking about a very great cause. He's talking about man's first disobedience, which is he is talking about the fall of entire mankind from grace. So it's a huge topic. It is not something like the ordinary poem. And so some might look at it as a very arrogant statement by Milton, saying that, okay, I am writing the greatest poem ever. But it's probably not arrogant. If you look at it, he is still invoking the muses, right? He is asking for the aid of the muse, the heavenly muse. So there is humility mixed with some kind of arrogance, maybe, but it is not arrogance. It is something that is to be taken as a daring attempt. Okay? And it is a daring attempt. You will find out when you read the poem. Okay, so this is how I would like to go and paraphrase this, because if you read the original, the form and the sentence structure might be a little bit complicated. So here the paraphrase is what you go through, right? So let me read it again. Sing heavenly muse of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that and the forbidden fruit that brought death and suffering into the world and caused the loss of Eden, until one greater man should come to restore it. Inspire me as you inspired the prophet on Mount Oreb. Okay, he's talking about Moses here, and he's saying, if it pleases you, muse Zion Hill or a Silas brook, then then let your voice from there come to aid me in my daring poem. He says, I am not going to do not intend to take an ordinary path. I aim to soar above the heights of classical poetry, signified by Aeonian mount, attempting things never yet tried in prose or verse. So, okay, now let's continue. Okay, the original poem continues. And chiefly thou, O Spirit, that dost prefer before all temples the upright heart and pure, instruct me, for thou knowest, thou from the first wast present, and with mighty wings outspread, dove-like satyrs brooding on the vast abyss, and made it pregnant. What in me is dark illumine, what is low raised and support, that to the height of this great argument, I may assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to men. Okay, so here is a layered invocation. Now he is invoking the spirit, right? So let me read the paraphrase so that the sentences become clear. And above all, O Spirit, who values upright hearts more than temples, guide me. You know everything from the beginning. You were present, hovering like a dove over the vast abyss, making it fertile. Okay, so um, here he is directly talking, invoking the Holy Spirit. First, it's interesting. There are two distinct entities that are invoked. First, he seems to be invoking the muses, but then again he mentions it's the heavenly muse, not the pagan ones. Probably not the nine muses. Okay. And then he's directly invoking the Holy Spirit, asking him to raise him and support in the great attempt that he's making. Okay, so okay, it is important to read this as Milton wrote it. You might want to be comfortable with the way that Milton went about writing his poem. Right? You might find it slightly difficult, but you might need to get used to it. Okay, so let's go further. Say first, for heaven hides nothing from thy view, nor the deep tract of hell. Say first, what cause moved our grandparents in that happy state, favored of heaven so highly, to fall off from their creator and transgress his will, for one restrained Lord of the world besides? Who first seduced them to that foul revolt? The infernal serpent, he it was, whose guile stirred up with envy and revenge, deceived the mother of mankind. What time his pride had cast him out of heaven with all his host of rebel angels, by whose aspiring aim to set himself in glory above his peers, he trusted to have equalled the Most High, if he opposed, and with ambitious aim against the throne and monarchy of God, raised impious war in heaven and battle proud with vain attempt. Okay, so let me read it in simpler format. So again, he's talking to the Spirit, Holy Spirit, and asks him, tell me first, for heaven hides nothing from your sight, not even the depths of hell. See, the original language is so beautiful. Heaven hides nothing from you, nor the deep tract of hell. So, the wonderful way of saying it, right? Deep tract of hell. So, that's what makes Milton's poetry worth reading. The way he uses words. See, knowing what the poem is about is not that important. Why? Because if you noticed in books, what Milton does is he, in the argument, he already mentions what the poem is about, what the book is about, like what the book one is about. He already mentions that. And then, subsequent to that, he writes the poem about the thing that he has already mentioned. So, what it signifies? It signifies there is a joy in reading Milton, in the way he writes the original poem. It's not just about the content, it's the way he presents it. If it's just about the content, then you would just read the argument that is given in top of the book, which summarizes the entire book one. So then there would be no point in reading the poetry format if you already know the argument, right? But as a student of literature, you might want to admire the way in which it is written. So that's what it is about. It is not just knowing what it is about, it is about knowing how things are written. It's a joy to read the actual work. So, yeah. Yeah, let's go about it. Yeah, so the simpler version is tell me first. Heaven hides nothing from your side, not even the depths of hell. Say what caused our first parents, Adam and Eve, right, so highly favored by God to fall. What made them fall and disobey Him for just one restriction? God had put just one restriction, not to eat of the forbidden fruit, right? Not to eat the forbidden fruit. That's all. But uh, the Adam and Eve ultimately are seduced and they are driven away from paradise. That's the content. So he says, tell me first, what caused our first parents, our ancestors, to fall and disobey him over just one restriction? Though they were rulers of the world, they could have anything, right, except the food, but still they disobeyed him. So he said, tell me first, who first seduced them to this rebellion? It was the infernal serpent, Satan, cunning, stirred by envy and revenge, deceived the mother of mankind. Who is the mother of mankind? Eve. This happened after his pride had cast him out of heaven with all his rebel angels. Aspiring to be greater than his peers, he trusted he could match the Most High and with ambitious aim waged impious war against God's throne. Okay, so um, let's read further. Now, here the language is so beautiful. Him, the Almighty Power, hurled headlong, flaming through the ethereal sky, with hideous ruin and combustion down to bottomless perdition, there to dwell in adamantine chains and penal fire. Who durst defy omnipotent arms? 9 times the space that measures day and night, mortal men, he with his horrid crew lay vanquished, rolling in the fiery gulf, confounded though immortal. Look at the language here. It's so he's describing Satan being cast down like a comet, rather, to bottomless abyss. Okay, so the Almighty hurls Satan headlong, flaming from the ethereal sky to bottomless perdition. Interesting choice of words. Perdition is what? Perdition is something like utter loss of happiness in future state. It is eternal damnation from which there is no redemption. It is the ultimate fall. It is the fall to a lowest of the lowest. Okay. Now, interesting choice of words. It's a beautiful choice of words, right? Hurled where to bottomless perdition, there to dwell in adamantine chains and penal fire. Adamantine chains, they are like it's an interesting choice of words again. Adamantine is unrelenting, and also it's a kind of crystal, right? It is quite strong. An interesting choice of a word penal fire. It's something that penalizing, right? It is just not an ordinary fire. It is going to torture you. How long? It was for 9 days and nights. Interesting way of saying that. 9 times the space that measures day and night to mortal men, he with his horrid crew lay vanquished. So, for 9 days and nights, as measured by mortal men, he and his horrid crew lay vanquished, rolling in the fiery gulf, confused though immortal. They are immortal, but they are confounded. Okay. Remember, dust is past tense of there, is dead. Perdition is eternal damnation. Okay. So, okay. So we'll continue this in our next video. Thanks for listening.